So we're going to find something out today. We're going to find out what happens when two renegade execs from a British tabloid organisation get together for a live chat. And we're about to find out what happens. How you doing, Chris?
I'm very well, thank you, Ricky. How are you?
Mate, I'm really good. Look, for those, most people know who we are, but let's just do a quick intro. So I was at News Corp in London for 8 years. I was the news editor of the News of the World, the now infamous News of the World, when it was still the best newspaper in the world. We sold 3 or 4 million newspapers every Sunday. We were as British as bacon and eggs on a Sunday morning. I remember a famous prime minister once said, and it was an amazing job, an amazing place at an amazing time, and we broke some amazing stories, and I loved it. Now, Chris, you and I, we actually didn't quite overlap, did we? You were there. I left in 2004 and was moved to run some of the businesses here at News Australia. But when did you join the Sun?
I joined 2007. Came in originally working on iMatter, data project actually, and then ended up coming through to be at across both the Sun and the Time. Also worked on project.
Chris, I'm getting your audio's a bit breaking up. Are you on a mic or are you just speaking straight to your phone?
Speaking straight to the phone.
Okay, all right. Well, let's see if we can get through that. I'm not quite sure what that was, but we'll figure it out. It should also be pointed out, this is we're both fervent Substackers, but this is our first go at a live video. So let's see how it goes. But what we wanted to talk about today was that Chris wrote a post a couple of days ago. Why don't you talk us through it?
Sure. I mean, the idea of just launched.
Still losing the audio, mate. I'm not quite sure what's happening.
I'm talking directly into the phone.
All right.
Oh, is that better if I hold that like that?
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'll hold it slightly at arm's length.
That's better.
That's better. Okay, good. So yeah, I wrote a post because the Sun had launched Sun Club, which was the latest version of trying to find a kind of premium subscription tier for the Sun. And it reminded me that it must be 10 years. It sort of felt like a 10-year period of grace had been allowed to pass since the original Sun Plus offer that I'd worked on. And it just brought back a lot of memories because for me, it was an amazing project. It was a very typical News Corp. Everybody says we can't do this. Can we do this project? And I learned an awful lot from it. So I just wrote a post saying, look, this is kind of what happened behind the scenes. And in hindsight, this is what we learned from it.
What was your role at the Sun when you were dropped this one? Because look, actually, just before I get to that, let's go back in time a little bit. So when I first turned up at News Corp in '97, all right, so that's a while ago. I think that might be a century ago in actual terms. We were just getting into digital at the time, and we were trying everything. I was the first head of digital, so I was head of digital for the News of the World. There was a head of digital for the Sun. My first day in the job was the 1st of January 2000. So how's that for a welcome to a new millennium? You're now head of digital. And at the time, we tried all kinds of things. We tried free websites with ads. I can tell you the first MREC ad I sold on the News of the World website, I sold for £45,000 for one day. I don't know what the CPM would account to, but I don't think you can get it on a bill. But it was a lot, okay? And it was for Hyundai, I can remember. And then what we did, we tried to launch an ISP. Now we don't really think of ISPs now. We get it all through our mobile phone services. You just buy data. But back then, you actually had to buy your broadband from a company, and we launched one called the Current Bun, which is the kind of internal affectionate story for the Sun. Current Bun, kind of Cockney rhyming slang. That was a hopeless disaster. Never worked. Cost a fortune, but it was okay because it was the dawn of the era and everybody was just like, come on, let's give it a go, see what we can do. It was a disaster. And then we went through ads and that went quite well. And then we covered all of September 11 and, and saw the traffic go through the roof. And suddenly our brands that were ostensibly British were now global. Yeah,
Yeah.
we were breaking stories on the day of September 11 that were being read across America and referenced on CNN Live. So I remember all of that explosion and how
Yeah.
thrilling it was. And we were just making it up because we were there at the dawn. And then the dot-com crash happened, and we'd grown the business up. I'd had the boss of the company come in and say to me, "We need to work out how much this company's worth." And I said, "Okay, well, we've got this many readers, and this is how much our ads are selling for." And he went away and he came back and he said, "I'm going to say $9 billion." And I was like, okay, right. But this was the dot com boom, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Everybody was into it. And then after hiring all these people and building all these ergonomic desks and building this exciting new world for what was typically a very traditional man operated newspaper business, yeah, then the dot-com crash happened. And one
Yeah.
day I was hiring people and running a multi-billion-dollar global business, and the next day I was selling chairs and tables on eBay. And no, I mean, I'm not even joking.
Yeah.
Literally, that's what happened. But we always knew that the Sun was like the News of the World. The Sun and the News of the World were British. Every single person had a copy of the newspaper in the back pocket of their jeans, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was amazing. And we knew that we needed to translate that to a digital future. The News of the World eventually got rolled into the Sun Online. It all became part of the same thing. And then the Sun took control. Okay,
Yeah.
I was moved away to the other side of the world, and you were still there. So can you so your role? Give me your role.
Yeah.
And yeah,
I joined 2007 as grandly titled Director of Customer Value, and I'd come in to sort of the brief that I'd been given was, look, the news brands need to think about becoming consumer brands in a digital world. We don't know our customers. We don't have any contact with them. We don't have any experience of that. So, can you help us kind of build that out? But that led you to working in the subscriptions business, which led to the Times paywall project. So that was, I had at the time we had a team of engineers who were building novelty iPhone apps,
yeah, I remember.
including like take the phone and it can pick your Grand National Force. Suddenly we find out that we got an email went round that said Rupert Murdoch has met Steve Jobs. We will be on the iPad. You know,
Yeah,
so we launched. In about sort of 8 weeks, had to try and launch a version of a newspaper on a. I remember sort of briefing the developers saying it's going to be a product no one's ever seen on a device, no one's ever touched. It's going to be great. And that launched the Times sort of subscription, digital subscription world. The Sun at the Times, as you say, was still big, free to air, going global. This was a point at which almost every digital site was just seeing record numbers and record numbers, record numbers.
yeah,
But I guess over the next sort of 2 or 3 years, the success of the Times subscription made people at News Corp start to think, well, hang on, if we can do this over there, what are we going to do on the Sun side? You could feel that the advertising market was starting to turn. The platforms were starting to become, better at selling advertising. We were starting to kind of sense there might have to be a slightly different approach. So that was where that project came in. And I think I was something like director of customer sales at the start of the project, and Katie Van Smith then went off to run the Journal. And so by the time we were in the thick of it, I was the CMO, basically chief marketing officer across the Sun and the Times.
Now, can you just talk us through the Times paywall? Because the Times paywall was a little bit different. It wasn't like a traditional paywall today. And I think the Times did a special edition in the afternoon or something. Can you just remind us how that happened?
Sure. I mean, it was really, it was the hardest of paywalls. You got nothing for free. And it was really centered around that iPad edition first thing in the morning, and then a kind of afternoon and evening update rhythm. So think of it really as kind of edition based, really aiming at people who wanted a newspaper reading experience predominantly. And the iPad was able to deliver that. And then we bundled together with it, the smartphone app, the website, and but it was more of a substitution for a newspaper habit than necessarily the kind of big tabloid mass market kind of 400 stories a day sort of
which
experience.
we see so much now. Can I ask you a tricky question? Because I wasn't there then. I wish I was. But quick question: do you think that Rupert? I mean, you've met him. I've met him. Do you
Mm.
think he would have said yes to a paywall and doing it if the iPad hadn't felt like a newspaper? I mean, the guy's in love with paper, right?
Yeah.
Always shown his whole career he's in love with paper. It didn't feel like such a scary transition to go from print to the iPad. It felt a bit like a newspaper that just happened to print itself.
Yeah, well, I'll be honest. He definitely would have done, because when that project started, the iPad didn't exist.
Right. Okay.
It was actually one of the greatest gifts that we could get, and I think it's fair to say, talk to the team there. With about 6 months to go, it was a really hard proposition to sell, because you were effectively saying this used to be a website that's free, now it's a website that's paid for. How do you like that, kind of? And then suddenly the
How do you
iPad
like that? How
arrived.
do you like them apples? Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
basically. And it's and no one else is asking you to pay, but we are. And then suddenly the iPad arriving allowed you to say, you've been paying for apps on your phone, you've been paying for newspaper editions. This is a newspaper edition on a bigger version of your phone. Of course, you're going to pay for it. And it made the whole project kind of fluid. It made sense for consumers.
I
So it
see.
was
So
a gift.
it wasn't so much a form factor similarity. It was an opportunity to transition to a new business model.
Yeah, and then it didn't hurt that actually you could build a product for it that let you swipe like pages. It
Yep.
it could it could it was a big enough screen that it could carry the kind of design sensibility of a newspaper. It allowed a lot of things to feel like a natural progression. Um, just with a price attached.
Hmm. All right. So last question on the Times before we move to the Sun. So did it work for the Times? Was
Yeah,
it? Was it? Yeah. So I mean, I don't want you to betray any secrets unless you actually want to, which would be
yeah,
lovely. But
yeah.
how did it work? How did it
So
perform?
well, in a couple of ways. One was, so this is all publicly available. One was that it got to 100,000 subscribers within the first year. Secondly, that it started out at £2 a week, £2 a week. Is that right? Yeah, £2 a week, but could quickly move through £4 a week. Eventually, got to £6 a week. So within sort of 3 or 4 years, you suddenly had a £300 a year digital product
Hmm.
that was in hundreds of thousands of subscribers, and it's become over the years. I mean, 10 years later, however long, it is a huge digital business.
Hmm. All right, good. So, for people listening, some people will know the Sun, some people won't. So, I'm going to give you the pleasure of going first to explain what the Sun is and what the Sun contains and what the Sun represents, and then I'm going to have a go. So,
Sure.
you go first.
It's Britain's biggest newspaper, and by that I mean it's the biggest, it's the loudest, it has the biggest voice, it has the biggest readership, it represents the broadest kind of audience in Britain. It does not pull its punches, so it is known for a kind of sense of humour. It's known for being irreverent. It's known for throwing punches first, and sort of holding everybody to account. And it is unashamedly mass market, and huge as a result. It's a great British brand.
It created the phrase red top. So in the UK, tabloid newspapers are known as red tops because the Sun represented that. So I'll give you my version of the Sun.
Mm.
So when I was 12 years old, I wanted to be a war correspondent. My dad was an adventurer, and I always wanted to be a war correspondent. And I was watching the Falklands War happening, and the News of the World was the only reporter, had the only reporter in the Falklands capital when it was retaken by British forces. And he wasn't a TV guy, but because there was no one else there, he got on TV on the camera and just basically said, the Falklands, Port Stanley is back in British hands, and did it. And I turned to my dad, I was at my grandparents' house, I turned to my dad and said, I'm going to do that. I'm going to be a war correspondent for the News of the World. And I went to my careers teacher at my school in Bristol, which was a really, really horrible school, and said to my careers teacher, hey, I'm going to be a war correspondent for the News of the World. And she said, have you thought about double glazing? Like, because I don't want you to like set your sights too high. And I just said, and I'm supposed to take advice from you as a career teacher in a sinkhole school in Bristol. And I got suspended from school, and my dad was so proud. And so I decided I was going to go and work at Wapping. And at Wapping, which was the headquarters of News Corp at the time, you had the Times, the Sunday Times, the News of the World, and the Sun all on campus. And so for me, I really wanted to go to the News of the World. That was what I'd set my sights on. But I kept getting these approaches from the Sun all the time. Come work for us, come work for us, come work for us. And so it was a big decision. Which do I go to? Which enormously popular, salacious, ground-shaking tabloid do I go to? And I was very honoured to have the opportunity to go to either, right?
Yeah.
But ultimately, I chose the News of the World. But here's a funny story, and I might share some more funny stories on this. Here's a funny story. So the Sun, you lot, down the corridor, the battle between the News of the World and the Sun sometimes came to blows in the corridor, literally, because we were fighting over stories. Do you remember? The competition was just so intense.
Yeah.
And then one day, someone, an editor, I'm not going to tell you who, said to me, Ricky, the Sun's got something that we really, really need, okay? And I need you to go and get it from the Sun. And it was going at 2 o'clock in the morning or something, or 3 o'clock in the morning when there's hardly anybody there. This is a pass, it will get you in. Go and get it. And so you don't say no to the editor. So I went in, and while I was in there, one of your security guards turned up, and all these lights went on. And then there was chaos. Police arrived, phone calls made to editors at 2 o'clock in the morning. And I ended up being suspended for 3 months, but it gave me a huge promotion at the end of it. So my relationship with the Sun was one of utter love and hate. We were fighting the same fight. We were SAS soldiers in tabloids together, but we would happily sell each other down the road in a heartbeat for the right story. And so for me, I loved the Sun because it was daily. I loved the News of the World because it had the massive scoops that just shook the world. And together, you know, to use a line from a terrible 80s show, we were murder. You know, we were great, right? And so the Sun, for me, really gave me the impression that it was the perfect brand for the digital era, for the global online internet era. It was salacious, it was celebrity, it was Hollywood, it was big stars, it was interviews. It was amazing. But it never seemed to quite manage to hit that. It never really quite managed to make its transition to digital. Am I being unfair? Because for me, it should have been BuzzFeed before BuzzFeed. It should have been Facebook before Facebook, but it didn't. It didn't go there.
Yeah, partly actually sometimes because it was too early. So I don't know if you remember. Were you there when they built My Sun?
When they built
My Sun.
Yeah, I was there.
Yep.
I was there. I was also on the board of MySpace, just so you know.
Yeah.
I kind of saw both sides of that.
So My Sun at one point had 500,000 people in the UK uploading text and images to a site that linked them all to their friends and allowed them to comment on the images and texts. And I think that must have been about 2000. It must have been 2008, 2009. It was closed down because nobody could see an ad model for it. So we sort of had Facebook in the equivalent of Facebook in the UK, but couldn't see a route to kind of making money from it. So sometimes it was too early.
At the News of the World, because we had so many comments on the stories and we couldn't moderate the comments, we decided to try and limit the comments to a shorter number of characters. And we were actually building Twitter before Twitter. And then funnily enough, when I came to Australia, I pitched to the board at News Australia that we should build what I was calling My X at the time, MYX. And the idea was that every city in Australia would have its own version wrapped around the local papers. So people would comment on the stories in here and keep it close. And it became known as Mix, MYX, which was actually a better name, I thought, than my version. Within the business isn't our space. Our space is to start the conversation, not to own the conversation. Yeah. And it felt like we missed an opportunity there.
Yeah.
And so with the Sun was free to start with. Am I right?
Yep.
With ads. And then it decided to go behind a paywall. And that was the project that you were given.
That's right. So it was So if you remember, the other thing actually about the Sun in terms of going global was, you remember the New York Post at the time sort of had the US franchise in tabloid, and
Yeah,
so the Sun never quite got to the US. It's done that more recently, but it hadn't done that really at the time. So, given the success of the Times, and the Times was, turning round its sort of financial fortunes and was seen to have this sort of model, and as you know, Rupert Murdoch was very keen on kind of, could he get to direct payment? Could he reduce the dependency on platforms?
yeah,
So the decision was taken to kind of to do the same thing with the Sun, and I think there was a recognition, at rooms that rooms above my pay grade, that wasn't going to be easy. So it needed a kind of a really big kind of catalyst to get it over the line. You weren't going to get another iPad, but you needed something to just say, why would you make the leap to pay for the Sun? So um, News UK kind of bid the Premier rights on mobile. Um,
yeah,
so this was at the point where, rights on mobile were kind of available at a pretty big discount from the TV rights, but they were a separate rights bid. And so that, the Sun was able to secure Premier League right, and it meant that the kind of the product could be built around that as your reason for understanding why you would pay for this, and not, it wasn't just the free website now paid.
yeah. So let's remember that when Rupert launched Sky in the UK,
Mm.
his what was then a satellite TV became a cable TV business. He did exactly the same thing. This was a playbook,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Buy the Premiership football rights, king make the sport. I mean, at the end of the day, if you've got 2/3 of the nation reading your newspaper every morning, and
yeah,
you're writing in the back about the football, and you're making the players into stars, then people go to watch the stars that they're now following in the papers on the TV, which you also own. It's like genius,
yes,
right?
it's
Yeah,
beautiful. Yeah.
yeah. And so this was the same thing, playing the same playbook. You think for Sun?
Well, and also at the time, if you remember, the CEO was Mike Darcy, who come from Sky, so
Yeah,
really understood the kind of
yeah,
sports licensing world, and how to make the most of them, and how to make sure that you kind of wrapped it in an exclusive. You how to tease it, but also how to make it exclusive. So there was quite a lot of a lot of sort of thought behind that as a starting point.
that's also another thing I've forgotten. Was that the English Premier League were probably the most aggressive exclusivity protectors I'd ever
Yeah,
come across.
yeah,
Like sometimes I'd be convinced I'd get a phone call from them before I'd even started to do the thing I was thinking about. Right? I don't know how they knew, but they
yeah,
certainly knew. They were worse than the Hollywood studios, worse than the music labels. They were
yeah.
tuned in. They must have had a camera in my office or something. But anyway, so you kick off and you're trying to use Premier League to be the magnet to drag
Yeah.
the Sun's 20 million readers over into an app where they'll pay a small amount to get access to the Premier League rights. Were you not cannibalizing yourself and your rights on Sky at the time?
No, because the Sky rights were really for the full games. So Sky was about watching a whole kind of live game of football. The clip rights were, we got sort of, it was after every goal, and it was on certain kind of delay, but it was only short form clips. It was very much kind of highlights on your phone. So it
Right.
was it was kind of negotiated to be an ideal customer would have Sky to watch the actual live games, but for all the other games in the league that week that with their team they didn't follow, they could get the clips kind of with the Sun, and it meant we could embed them in a lot of the sports stories. So your sports reporting in the morning would also have the clips of the goals embedded in them, which
Yeah.
really improved your kind of sports coverage.
Transformational. So can
Yeah.
I just ask, this is an odd question for people that don't work in the media, right? But I'm fascinated to hear what happened. How did the sports desk of the print title react to this? Because suddenly the digital version was better than the print version.
I think you also know the newsroom were this was supported by the owner and the CEO, and the editor of the time, and therefore everyone was delighted.
Yes, indeed. It's amazing being the boss, isn't it? Because everybody
Yeah,
just you become the boss and suddenly you're a genius.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
we've both lived it. All right,
yeah.
cool. So you get this thing up and running with football rights in the Sun. tell me about the building process and the building, because this is a whole. Well, you've had to go with the times.
Yeah.
Did you build it all in house? Did you outsource it? How did you make it happen?
No, so a lot of it was you could sort of port it across from what had been built for the times. Some of that was in house, some of that was outsourced. You know, all of the kind of everything you'd learned about things like CDNs and how you could manage a paywall and all the rest of it was sort of moved over. You knew that the Sun, so the sort of the edition was the standout for the Times, but it probably wasn't going to be that way for the Sun, so that was different. Wrapping in things like football rights. I mean, you imagine just like everything with those projects, you've always got about half the time you would like. So
Yeah,
there's a team sort of furiously putting together a whole process for actually getting clips from the Premier League and being able to broadcast them into a kind of a Sun experience. 2 minutes after every goal's gone in, or 5 minutes. Whatever the timing was. A massive amount of work has to go into that. And then there's a huge piece around how do you actually market this, and all of the discussions that you'd expect around, well, if we're going to paywall everything. So we were effectively going to put everything behind the paywall except a limited amount of teaser material. How far down an article would we go? What would happen if we broke an exclusive? How would that work?
yeah,
I mean, this is still a time, and we were talking about this the other day, when you were still doing, I think, dummy editions.
yeah.
And you might want
Explain
to,
that. Explain that to the people listening. Well, actually, I'll have a go. I'll have a
yeah,
go. So imagine the situation. You've got the biggest story in the country for the next day, and the whole world is going to stop and choke on their bacon.
yeah,
It's what my editor, one of my editors, I love this. One of my editors said to me, Ricky, what we work on, okay, is FMDs. That's all we focus on, FMDs. And I said, what's that? And he said, I want stories so big that someone drops their bacon and goes, fuck me, Doris, have you seen this? That in a
yeah,
nutshell is what we're
yeah,
working for the British tabloids in their day was. Fuck me, Doris. That
yeah,
was all we wanted from our readers, was that reaction. And so what we used to do was, when we had a really, really big story, we knew that those horrible tabloid rivals at the Daily Mail and everywhere else were just waiting. They had a whole army of really cheap people sitting in newsagents, or even throwing 50 quid at somebody down at the printing press to get the first copy of the paper off so they could see
yeah,
what the story was on the front page. And because it was first edition at 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening, it gave them enough time to scrap their newspaper, rewrite their version, and get the story on the front page themselves. So what you used to do was you used to publish all your early editions of the paper had a different front page,
yeah,
a dummy front page, right? And so
yeah,
you'd find some story that was halfway good and just about good enough for your competitors to think that that was okay. And then you'd go to all the cost
yeah.
of publishing 1,000,000 copies of it on paper, just so you got yourself an extra
Yeah.
hour and a half for
and,
your
and
big scoop.
and put them in the King's Cross newsagent, wasn't it? It was always like but
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly right.
yeah,
Strategically place them in the newsagents where you knew that they were waiting.
yeah,
Genius.
it's amazing.
Genius.
So all of the kind of planning around, what would you do if you had that exclusive on a kind of Saturday night or Friday night? Would you publish it digitally first? As you can imagine, as you say, the print teams were very keen that they would still be able to break exclusives and that wouldn't be taken over. So there's a lot of work on that. And we spent a long time talking about, we had this phrase which was pub ammo, which is what do you give people? It was very important that the Sun reader was given the pub ammo that if they paid for Sun Plus, and their mate turned around and went, "What are you paying for that for?" You can do X, Y, Z. You can get this free on the Mirror. You can get clips from Bulgaria. You can do whatever. Why would you say, "Well, I've decided to pay for it for these reasons"? And we spent a long time building out the marketing campaigns for that, and then
Mm,
also building a rewards club. So you know how big promotions are for the Red Tops. So the 950
mm.
holidays, the kind of the offers, 2 for 1s, all that kind of drives.
Booze
Yeah,
cruises on Sea Link, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, drives the paper. So it was turning that into a digital rewards club that you would get if you were also a member of Sun Plus.
Mm,
So as you can imagine, a huge project with lots of different work streams, all kind of culminating to the launch then of tied in with the football season.
mm-hmm.
One
All
thing
right.
actually I didn't put in the article because it didn't really fit with the rest of it was I highly recommend, if you're ever doing projects of this type, have an immovable date. because the
Yeah.
amount of decisions that got made in that project, because we could not miss the first game of the football season, there was a real sort of ruthlessness about how that
Yeah.
project went through, because everybody knew you had to be ready on, I think it was August the 8th. You had to be ready for August the 8th. First game, first goal, the whole thing has to work. And so it was a pretty well executed project to launch.
Newspapers, journalists are supposed to be good at deadlines, right? So
Yeah,
maybe it seems ironic that we didn't always use that approach for all the things that we did, because some of them stretched on forever. So tell me, so the project gets live, the Sun comes out as a subscription product. Um, how did it fare as a business? Now you were in charge of the P&L, right? So you're the
yeah,
guy. I know what those phone calls are like, right? You got this little phone on your desk, it rings, and you're like, I am absolutely in two minds whether I'm going to pick that up, right?
yeah,
Because it could be almost anyone. There's no clue, right? It's like, oh no. So you're that man. You're the man with the sweaty palms, right?
yeah, yeah.
How did it go?
So it was. So we were, in some ways, we were lucky because we'd seen with the Times. It doesn't jump the first day like you thought it might. So we'd sort of prepared for that. We knew what that was like. But it turned into, I mean, it was like it launched in a big way. It made a lot of noise, and people were curious about it. And we got some reasonably decent numbers quite early on. But the story of the whole project was we could get people in the door, but we couldn't hang on to them. So we could get people to come in and sample the product. But once people sort of saw that they were going to pay, and they were going to pay something like it was £8.66 a month, um, which is the equivalent of £2 a week for
Right.
mathematical reasons which are too hard to explain to consumers on the phone. So it was £8.66 a month, which is just over £100 a year, which for Sun readers was a like not insurmountable, but a material amount of money.
Yeah, it's a chunk.
Um,
Yeah.
and so we saw a lot of people come in, take a free trial. We saw a lot of people get to the first month of payment, but the drop off from that first month to the second month was huge. And I think that again, it's public information, but we recruited well over 1 million people, during the piece, and never got above 200,000 subscribers,
Right.
or if anything, trickled over the top of that.
But 200,000 subscribers isn't a joke. I mean, the Washington Post is up around that number now. So, that should be viewed as a win, shouldn't
And I think if you think about where the Post is, it might have been had we felt that way. But what we actually were doing was, we in the end could tell that the Mirror, the Mail, the Star, this was like the greatest gift that the Sun could give them, because they suddenly had access to all of the free traffic. They all had subscriptions, and I think we talked in the piece about, we could time from the minute that we published anything that was exclusive. The Mail Online would generally have the same story up within 8 minutes, under fair use kind of copy. They would say the Sun reports that Ricky Sutton has raised himself in a bar in Plymouth.
it? That wasn't
Um,
me. That was a lookalike.
and
Happened all the time in pubs all over the country.
it would be attributed, it would be linked to, but it was, they were just, they were all over us. And the Mirror grew its football coverage exponentially. The just, so you could feel that it was pretty hard to break stories in the way that the Sun wanted to. And it wasn't, in the end, from a brand perspective, a big proposition. It might have been financially transformative in the long run, but it wasn't a big proposition, which Sun really needs to be.
Yeah. So do you think the Sun was a bit of a victim of its own success in that scenario? That it had to be bigger than Ben Hur. That was
Yeah,
another phrase I used to hear a lot of the time. Is this Ben Hur or not? Like, because I'm not interested otherwise. Did,
yeah,
did, it, did the success have to be bigger than Ben Hur for it to really win over the momentum that you need to support it in an organisation
yeah.
the size of the UK?
I mean, one of the things I think in hindsight is you did end up in a little bit of crap around pricing. Was that we'd invested pretty heavily in the Premier League rights, and you needed to get a return on that. I mean, sports rights kind of return on investment is a very well trodden path, and people understand if you pay a lot of money for the rights, you have to have a way of getting that back. But in the end, that kind of overhead meant that you ended up with a cost to the consumer which was probably higher than your optimum price would have been just to get scale.
Oh, I
So to
see.
put that in sort of play, had we come in and said it's £1 a year, it could have been a lot bigger by volume, but it would have been a very different sort of shape.
So you're saying that there wasn't really a willingness at that time to use the Premier League rights as a loss leader.
I think it was probably too big a price.
Right. Okay. Oh, you try and give us a clue.
No.
So you and I have been mates for a long time. So I've got a confession to make. It's got nothing to do with that pub in Plymouth, by the way. That just wasn't
Yeah.
the. I always thought it was a terrible mistake to go behind a paywall, and the reason was because I was still seeing growth in traffic and growth in engagement, and I was watching relatively competitive domestic newspapers starting to make a global reputation for themselves by using digital. The Guardian's a good example, The Telegraph. I'd seen these papers that were a big deal in the UK, but really didn't mean much to people in America, suddenly being talked about on television in America, because I was traveling there a lot for work.
Yeah.
And so I was seeing these people, and I was thinking, the Sun, how's the Sun not winning here? Because the Sun is everything American tabloids love, right? It's everything American consumers love. It should be a perfect marriage. The paper might be based in the UK, but the person on the front page is probably Brad Pitt. Yeah. And he's not from Dagenham, right?
Yeah.
And so I figured that the Sun was perfect translation to America. If any paper should have gone to America first, it should have been the Sun. And I did sometimes wonder that, and it's just my opinion, was that the leaders of the Sun were so successful in newspapers, they didn't feel the need desperately to get into digital. And when they did get into digital, no matter what they said or what the marketing said, it was always half-hearted. Yeah. And interior in the office, in the meetings that really matter, which are the ones that are away from the newsroom floor and in the boardroom, you know, in that, you remember that boardroom with the white carpet and everything?
Yeah.
It's like out of the 60s, out of James Bond, yeah, stroking a cat. You know, and they basically say, you know, yes, 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 but, and the subtext was always kinda.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, I think
You
it's fair to
recognise
say,
that?
yeah, I think so, and I think that's partly because News Corp at that time was very much it was a US organization and an Australian organization and a UK organization kind of
Yes.
under a parent, and
Good point.
so I don't think it was necessarily pushing from that sort of center. It wasn't necessarily pushing everyone go global and compete. And because the print newspapers were quite separate, sort of they stopped when they hit the sea. Sometimes the digital footprints tended to reflect that.
Yeah, no, you're right. So News Corp, everybody knows News Corp is the largest media company in the world, but it's actually not. It's a large media company in the UK, a large media company
Yeah,
in America, and a large one in
yeah,
Australia, and they barely talk to each other, right?
yeah. I think more now than ever, you can see there are some roles that have gone in that are kind of global. I think the Sun's gone to the States, the Times is a .com, the Journal's doing more in Europe. So perhaps it's more global than it ever was, but it certainly wasn't. It wasn't top of the list then.
But it was slow to it, right?
Yeah,
And when everybody else was doing it, it wasn't.
yeah,
When I first came to Australia in 2004, the very first thing I did was to ring back to London and say, look, I can help the newspapers here in Australia, but that's not what I want to do. You should be letting me launch the Sun and the News of the World here
yeah, yeah.
in Australia, right? You've got everybody here in Australia is interested in those same kinds of things. Just wasn't viewed as a thing. So anyway, back to the paywalls, because that's what we're talking about.
Yep.
What finally happened with your business? Because it didn't last, right?
No. So I think we did just under 2 years in the end, but I would say that last year was pretty attritional. One of the things that we definitely did was we got better at running that model every week. Right, we had teams who absolutely threw themselves into it. A great editorial team, who really tried to understand how they could kind of work with this system. We tried different versions of the rewards. We tried different versions of the paywall. We tried all kinds of stuff to kind of get it to move, but eventually, and this was actually when Rebecca came back as CEO. I think it was sort of in the end, she kind of came and put it out of its misery. It was sort of an acceptance that we'd given it.
She was good at that. I say
Yeah,
that with affection because I worked with her
yeah,
for a long time. So maybe I'll share an anecdote about that a little bit later on.
yeah. But I think it was in some ways. I remember the feeling of the team at the time was like you were really disappointed because you always believed you'd get there in the end, but there was also that sense of kind of like weary soldiers getting taken off the watch. It was like, well, okay, all right, it's maybe this is the best thing, and then within probably a year and a half, it was the biggest mobile website again. So
Yeah.
it could flip and then go back to being kind of big and bold and free in a way that maybe suits the brand a bit better.
So, fast forward, okay. My experience of projects at News Corp were, especially the big throaty ones, the ones that you and I used to get
Mm.
thrown into, the ones that required people who were really good at what they did, but also fearless in not worrying about breaking what they did to do the
Yeah.
next thing. Yeah, that had that kind of aspirational, innovative, kind of early adopter mindset,
Mm.
which wasn't everywhere. Okay,
No.
it wasn't spread through the business. And so when you do a big business like that, what I learned most from News Corp was to, well, I think what I'd say is my experience is measured in the scar tissue, which probably covers about 80% of my body, right?
Yeah.
But all of those scars are experience, right?
Yeah.
And it sets you up to do what you want to do next, and makes you
Mm.
better the second time. So the Sun was in free, then it was
Yep.
in paid,
Yep.
then it was in free. We're doing media hokey pokey here. It's in out. It's
Yeah.
going
Yeah.
in again, right? Yep.
Yeah.
So what's happening there now, and what advice have you got for the bloke who's sitting in your old chair going like this, going, this sounds like fun,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so the model they've gone for this time is slightly different in that they've really just picked off that premium tier. So I think you've seen this in a few other places the last couple of years, which is that there's sort of an area of the journalism. Think of classic print columnists that
yeah,
also then publish those columns online.
yeah,
The audience that will read those columnists will also potentially pay to read those columnists in digital. That's a different audience from people who are reading, 1,000 Love Island stories on a mobile phone and who are kind of dotting around digital platforms.
yeah,
So I think this idea of sort of premium subscription is really saying, think of all of the content that the Sun has. There is an area of that content that is being paid in print and that can be paid for in digital. Can we kind
yeah,
of pick that off and add it to our list of revenues that we can take? But we're going to leave the big bulk, the mass of the content, free to air, which means we keep our positions in Google, we keep our kind of power with advertisers. We end up, we have the kind of ranking and the domain power that you need to kind of be able to live the platform side of the world.
yeah.
So
So,
it's a kind of it's a pretty smart uh, trick if you can pull it off. You can end up with a few million in revenue that come from that route, um, while keeping the 85-90% the advertising money, because the advertising money does not come from those columns put up online.
yeah.
So yeah, that's what this version is.
This is a recurring theme, so I'm starting to see this emerging from some other papers around the world. And the logic is that there are elements of our newspaper that are generic, breaking news, our
Yeah,
reporting. There's some of our journalism that's exclusive, and we might continue to use that on both platforms, but probably still leave it outside the paywall because it shows and maintains and secures and buttresses our brand.
yeah,
But then there are elements of what we do that are exclusive that, might be a columnist, might be opinion, right?
yeah,
So
yeah,
there's people spinning off opinion. For the New York Times, it's been games, right?
yeah,
And so we can spin some of those off and we can make them monetizable in their own right. That seems to be a theme that the publishing industry globally is giving a go to. So the
yeah.
Sun this time is in quite early on this instead of late. So, how do well, two things. First of all, do you think it's going to succeed?
Yeah, I would think so. I can't work out what scale. the interesting question really is, what scale does it need to get to succeed? Because in some ways, it's all incremental revenue.
Yeah, because it's not got the big ballast cost of
Exactly.
something like EPR. Yeah.
Yeah, and so what we do have to be thinking about, I think, as publishers, is there is a print audience that is going to substitute eventually in digital, and that sort of rate of substitution is accelerating. So there is an element where we can substitute some of that paid print circulation into paid digital circulation, and having a kind of a landing zone for that audience is sensible. So
Mm.
if we manage to keep, let's say, half of the people who are stopping buying a newspaper, we manage to get to pay a small amount to read some things online that they're familiar with, it's a success. I don't think it's going to become the dominant revenue source for the Sun
No.
digitally, but then I don't think that's how you judge it to be a success.
So you owned the P&L. So everybody should know that, tell everybody about your last job, the job you.
Oh, you broke up there, Ricky.
Oh, you still there? Yeah, hey, you're back. Go on. I was just saying. So you must be a glutton for punishment because you keep taking jobs where you're in charge of the P&L, which is the
Yeah.
worst job in media. So you were at News and you own the P&L there. Tell
Yeah.
us what you've done since then.
Well, then actually after the Sun project, I went back and ran the Times for a bit, and then I went over to Bauer Media and ran the magazine business there. So yeah, and that was 100 P&Ls. Every magazine with a separate P&L.
I thought I had scar tissue, man. Yours must be
Yeah, yeah,
9
yeah.
inches thick, right? That must be amazing. All right, so you think that the Sun's got a decent model here. What do you think success looks like? So somebody must have written a Excel spreadsheet somewhere, and
Yeah.
someone must have a 60-page slide deck somewhere. What do you think the last page of that says for a paper like the Sun in 2025?
I think it's going to say, what is it? It's £2 a month. So it's going to be sort of, let's say, 25 quid a year. Probably by the time you discount and mess around with it, but let's say 20 quid a year per subscriber. If you can get that to, let's say, 250,000, you're kind of a 5 million business, net off the cost of, that's a decent kind of solid.
But it's a remonetization of something you're already paying for, right? So this is
Yeah.
purely incremental.
Yeah. So I would say you do pick up some costs. You've got to pick up some costs of marketing and things like that. But that, I think, would be a decent result. They get to 250,000. They'll have gone past, where we got to with putting the whole thing behind a paywall and still kept all the advertising revenue. So that to me would feel like a success.
All right. Okay. Well, I'm going to leave you with an anecdote. I promise an anecdote. So in 2000, late 2000, which, by the way, I don't want anybody to remember that this is 24 years ago or 24
Yeah.
and a half years ago, but apparently it is. Okay. I had no hair then. I've barely changed. Right. So I hit on this idea that one of the great golden assets and one of the most beloved parts of the News of the World was an agony aunt column called Dear Deirdre. And it was on the letters page. And it used to run a letter. It was eventually parodied by Viz. But basically it would say, Dear Deirdre, comma, my love life with my husband is becoming quite boring because he's so busy at work, and now he's got a new secretary, and I'm worried about what might be happening. Okay, and so what should I do? And then Dear Deirdre, who was basically someone's daughter on Work Experience,
Yeah.
would then write a response that would say, well, I think the important thing to do is to get yourself down to Primark, get yourself some nice underwear, and let's see how we can make it work. And it's all very, 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 very cheesy, but it was just part of what Britain was as a society at the time.
Yeah.
And to make it a little bit more exciting, they'd get a picture of some model that had cost like £80, and they'd gone and done a photo shoot. And there was a whole studio set up for Dear Deirdre on a Thursday morning. And they'd go down and they'd shoot some pictures, and it would be like some kind of sultry model, at Primark. Yeah. I was like, this thing's a gold mine. We should do this with the models and film it and make it video and put it behind a subscription paywall. And we did. We shot 6 episodes. And I was convinced this thing was going to go off like a firecracker. And and I had to try and explain it to the editor at the time, who was still figuring out what digital was, let alone let's shoot the models in Dear Deirdre and try and sell it as some sort of subscription TV product. Anyway, suffice to say, I still have those clips somewhere. And what a missed opportunity. We could have saved the whole company with that. It was amazing.
If only I know. Do you know one of my great regrets, Ricky, is I left news. I was actually on the rotor, because sometimes they would let staff members appear in Dear Deirdre, and it was like a great honor that you would be in. You would be the guy like stood in his stood looking confused at the doorway while his girlfriend drove off or something.
That's the one.
And I was due, but unfortunately COVID hit, and my photo shoot never materialized.
There you go, buddy. You see, this is the thing, right? They owned 20th Century Fox at the time. They never invited us to go and be in any of those Hollywood movies, did they?
No.
Cannot believe it. Mate, it's been a great trip down memory lane. Thank you for the business insights. That's super interesting. The whole subscription model to me is opaque. I don't really know it very well. I hope that that's been useful. I find it very useful. Look, let's watch. Maybe we'll review again in a couple of months and see how they're performing when the numbers come out. But for now, mate, thanks so much. I've really enjoyed the chat. Let's find something else to talk about.
Pleasure. Thanks, Ricky.
Oh, actually, just before you jump, I wonder if anybody's got any questions. We've got a couple of people on the line. Did anybody have a question that they wanted to ask? I think you can message us. Just give it a mo. I don't mind if you don't want to after some of those stories about Dear Deirdre. That's fine. Maybe you could write your question, Dear Deirdre, and then we'll respond to it.
You can see the pair of us. You can see the pair of us staring at this. We've never done this before, so we're like, "What happens when someone asks us a question?"
It looks like people are being shy. We'll leave it. Maybe next time. All right. Well, look. Thanks, everyone.
Pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
See you
Catch
later.
you later, buddy. Cheers,
Bye-bye.
man. See ya.